Hello, everyone, and welcome to a Chabura public shiur. Tonight, we have with us our Rosh Bet Midrash, Senior Rabbi of the S&P Communities, Rabbi Joseph Dweck. In this two-part series, we're going to be exploring Rambam's fundamental introduction to his commentary to Pirkei Avot. We will also, Rosh Bet Midrash will also be talking a little bit about our new initiative, Gateway to Sepharad. We're very excited for this new initiative geared towards students in yeshivot. And with that, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you so much. Everyone's going to be listening afterwards. And Chacham, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rabbi Ohad. So good to see you, and so good to see everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in. So tonight we have two items on the agenda. The first, as Rabbi Ohad mentioned, is this new initiative that the Habura is launching that we're calling Gateway to Sfarad, which recognizes that there are many people in yeshiva, and as it is, the majority of the yeshivot out there are not traditionally Sfaradi, which is fine. There's many yeshivot, and that's something that Sfaradim have to think about. You know, why are there not more yeshivot that are traditionally Sfaradi as we kind of follow here at the Habura? Nonetheless, there is an initiative that we're launching that is offering actual Sfarim, actual books, to yeshiva students wherever they are, well, almost wherever they are, that present an approach to either halacha or machshava or various elements of Torah from a classical Sfaradi perspective. And so this is something that I think, if I'm not mistaken, the last tally that we had was something over 100 students already that are in yeshivot that have seen this and that have shown interest in receiving, various svarim. And I just wanted to say about this, it's the idea is not that, these are better or that these are, more valuable or, more preferable for Talmidim to learn. It's simply recognizing that there's more to learn, that there is broader perspective, and that it is the case, unfortunately, but again, I'm not faulting the yeshivot themselves per se. They have their own derech, and they focus on their own, hachamim and their own approach, and you can't focus on everything. Oftentimes, what's taught in the yeshivot doesn't have sensitivity to many of the hachamim that our ancestors or our forebears studied, were familiar with, and for that matter, the hachamim themselves. There's been many times where I've mentioned some Sfaradi hachamim to very learned people that had been through yeshivot, and they didn't even know their names, right? But they nonetheless were very excited to study, these Inyanei Torah when I presented it to them, and I even did study, Behavruta several times with people, these things. So there are many things that are available. I'll give example. Likelihood is that if you're in the yeshiva, you're studying Talmud, right? And there's every yeshiva has their own derech of studying the Talmud. Oftentimes, what it is reading a sugya. Of course, hopefully you're reading Gefet, Gemara, Perush Rashi, Tosefot. And that's what's done. People read through Rashi, they go through the Tosafot, they spend a lot of time oftentimes on the Tosafot. Sometimes they'll try and see them farshim on the Tosafot. Often, in general, Tosafot is very difficult to do without having bikiyut through Shas, because what Tosafot does is give hyperlinks all over Shas, from one sugya to the next sugya, from one sugya to the next sugya. But nonetheless, then, there's this run through Rishonim. And, a traditional approach among many Sfaradim, certainly Adot HaMizrach, Hachamim, was first of all to focus very much on Rashi himself, just to be able to understand Rashi. And I learned for 3 years on a daily basis with Rabbi Shemona Aluf, and we spent full 3 hours just trying to understand the sugya according to Rashi, and to be careful and sensitive about his words. When Rashi says kilomar, that is to say, well, what did he think you thought it would say? And that in and of itself is not at all easy to be able to recognize and understand. And that itself is extremely valuable with regards to how it is that we learn. There's a Sefer Mishmerot Kehuna that we also learned with Rabbi Lu for 3 years, written by Rabbi Abraham Kohen Yitzhaki, who's Jerba. He's from Jerba. Going, absolute going, right? Just his insights in terms of the basic words of Rashi, his insights into the elements of Tosafot itself are mind blowing. I mean, they're absolutely mind blowing. Most of the rabbis in yeshiva won't even know about the Mishmerot Kiona. It's not easy to study, and it's not easy, the Mishmerot, not at all easy. But nonetheless, I encourage, Talmidim in yeshiva to seek, for example, a copy of the Mishmerot Kiona, and they finally printed it new. I had to read it in the old version, which was hard enough to understand the Mishmerot Kiona, but there were all kinds of typos in it that made it much more difficult to understand because you thought it was saying one thing and really saying another. But now they have it newly printed, and I encourage Talmidim in the yeshivot to look for it, try to learn it, try and understand it. It's very important. And of course, I wish there was more halakha in general that was studied in the yeshivot. Not so focused. Many of the yeshivot are not so focused. I was very lucky. I was in Hazon Ovadia, Chacham Ovadia, Zecher Tzadik Levracha. Used to come once a week to give shiur in the sugyot that we were learning, and of course everything was according to halacha. And Chacham Yitzhak Yosef also, the current Rishon Zionige, who was our rabbi. I had shiur with him on a daily basis, and we did all of the sugyot of the Gemara. Alibadi l'cheta. We went through the Bet Yosef, Shulchan Aruch, and the Rishonim and Harudim, and the dinim that we did. That's also very important because there's an understanding that we're learning Torah in order to be able to know what to do, right? How it is that it manifests lehalacha. So those are examples, and there's other. So that means that who are the poskim? Thankfully, I had Chacham Ovadia Yosef as a teacher, and I came to be familiar with the poskim because of him, because he amazingly crossed party lines. He didn't have any prejudice whatsoever in terms of who it is that he quoted. He quoted young, old, Ashkenazi, Sfaradi, Hasidi. Didn't matter. If somebody had something valuable to say in the inyan that he was writing, he quoted them. It was astonishing that he knew them and he read them, but he did, and he crossed party lines and he quoted everybody. And that will be a good segue for our next agenda. But nonetheless, I highly encourage the Talmidim to recognize that it's not that one is better than the other, one is over the other. I'm not suggesting that in any way, and I'm saying that only because people shouldn't misunderstand me as saying that. I'm simply saying there is tradition that we have that is being lost, or I often say the volume is being has been turned way down on it. And there are great hachamim with tremendous insight and understanding that in the general mainstream yeshivot they don't study, and it's a shame. So these svarim that we're offering are offering you at least to get familiar with them and to be able to come to know them a bit and spend some time studying them. So I say that, and stay tuned on the Chabura's outlets, and we will let you know more about it, and you'll hear about which svarim are available and so on and so forth. The second thing, of course, on our agenda is the core of the shiur, and that is the Shemona Peraqim of HaRambam. Now, I'll say this about the Shemona Peraqim. I'm giving the shiur and the next shiur because I was requested to give the shiur, and I didn't decline. I don't like to decline too many times. But you will notice, people who are familiar with my Torah will recognize, you might have not noticed it, I never, ever quote the Shemona Peraqim. When I say never, ever, maybe once in a very blue moon, I quote the Shemona Peraqim. And the reason for that is because in my experience, this is like ani afar va'efer, I'm genuinely dust and nothingness compared to anyone, who's anyone of the Rishonim, certainly Morenu HaRabbeinu Gadol HaRambam. But HaRambam wrote the Shemona Peraqim when he was very young. And it happens to be that the information or the material that he wrote in the Shemona Peraqim was extremely valuable to him. And so he wrote it again in various forms later in life. And he did it better. and that's what I am saying, and that's my humble experience of it. But I don't say that in any way, shape, or form to evaluate the Shemona Peraqim as if I had any koach at all to do that. And it may be that HaRambam, would say, "You stupid idiot! How could you say such a silly thing?" But nonetheless, in my experience of HaRambam's writings, the majority of what it is that HaRambam wrote in the Shemona Perakim, he refined and did broader and deeper in the Mishneh Torah and in the Moreh Nebuchim. So I very rarely quote the Shemona Perakim. Also, there's elements in the Shemona Perakim that are very much a part of HaRambam's time in terms of the medicine that he writes and some of the understanding of the nature of the world and how it works that he writes over there. He writes much more that way in the Shemona Perakim than he does in the Mishneh Torah and the Moreh Nebuchim. So that's just a preamble, but I don't want Has Shalom to put anybody off from. I mean, I've learned the Shemona Perakim, and more than once, and I think that it's if you're a genuine student of HaRambam, you should learn it. You must learn it, right? You have to see how HaRambam wrote and how he treated things. But nonetheless, I don't often quote it. So what I'm going to do, I mean, it's very difficult because it's called the Shemona Perakim, as you might guess, because it is comprised of Shemona Perakim. It's comprised of 8 chapters. And these chapters are introductory chapters, right? So HaRambam, where do you find the Shemona Perakim? The Shemona Perakim is part of HaRambam's Perush LaMishnah. HaRambam wrote a full commentary on the Shisha Sidrei Mishnah, on the 6 on the 6 full volumes of the Mishnah, and he did this at a very young age, from 23 till 37 years. He spent writing this pretty much off his mind. He wrote it. He says at the end of it that I wrote this as I was traveling and running for our lives and having to leave Spain and on boats. And so if I've made a mistake, he says, please judge me the kaf zechut. She judge me favorably. But nonetheless, it was a young work, right? It was a work that he did when he was a young man, brilliant, exceptionally, brilliant young man, but it was written in his younger life, and he writes introductions to certain chapters and tractates throughout his commentary. So he does not just write commentary to the Mishnah. There are certain sections when he reaches them, he writes introductions to the sections. So he writes an introduction to the entire work, right? Which is absolutely essential for people to learn and read. I think people need to learn through it. I would say every couple of years. I think it's absolutely essential. And I have a full set of shiurim on the Hakdama of HaRambam's Perush Mishnah that I did for Mishnah Study. It's called Mishnah Study, I think .com, for Jesse Salem. And I think it's 25 classes or something like that, maybe more. But it's a full treatment of the Hakdama of HaRambam. And he wrote other Hakdamot. He wrote, for example, before Perek Chelek, very well known. Perek Chelek in Sanhedrin talks about Olam Haba, talks about Gan Eden, talks about these kinds of things. So he writes a whole introduction to Perek Chelek in his commentary. He writes a full introduction to Seder Taharot, right? The whole Seder that deals with Tumah and Tahara, purities and impurities. And he writes it's unbelievable, this Hakdama that HaRambam writes, because he goes through all of the principles of Tumah and Tahara in this introduction. And he actually says, you have no idea what I've done for you here. He says it explicitly. I've with tweezers, I'm using that word, but he says, I've taken from one place here and another place there and another place there. I put it all together for you. And I've created a full treatment of the principles of Tumah and Tahara for you. You should learn it by heart, he says, right? You must learn this by heart. You must learn it before you learn anything about Tumah and Tahara. And of course it was difficult because there's no Gemara in Masechet on Seder Taharot, right? There's no Talmud on Seder Taharot. So HaRambam had to take everything that he took from whatever was written in the Mishnah and so on and so forth and put it into that. It's very, very important. So one of the introductions that he writes is to Pirkei Avot, right? The Masechet Avot is part of the Mishnah at the end of Nizikin, Seder Nizikin. And he writes an introduction, and there are 8 chapters to his introduction, right? There are 8 sections to his introduction, and it's known in general by people, Shemona Peraqim. It's the 8 chapters that introduce his commentary on Masechet Avot. So it's not his commentary on Masechet Avot. He has a commentary on Masechet Avot. He introduces his commentary with the Shemona Peraqim. Right? Now, what he does in the introduction of his commentary is he talks about the elements of the human being that we need to understand in order for us to be able to enter into ourselves, as it were, and refine our character. So he believes that it is best to understand more about the nature of a human being in order to be able to refine one's character, right? Refine one's attribute and the way that one lives and one's habits and so on and so forth. So if you know more about your spiritual self, you know more about your physical self, you know about how these things interact and interplay, the better it is for you to be able to begin working on yourself. And that's really a great deal of what the Shemona Peraqim deals with. So much of it is based on HaRambam's knowledge of a human being, right? How the body works, and for that matter, how the soul works, and so on and so forth. And not to discount that, but it's some of it is he even developed it as you know, as he went on. But nonetheless, there it is. So what we're going to do with it tonight is I'm not even going to begin any one of the 8 Peraqim, right? Because we're not going to sit and read through all of the 8 Peraqim. I'm not even going to read through one of the Peraqim. Next week, maybe we'll begin to do one of the Peraqim. I'll decide which one. What I want to do with you tonight is simply look at his preamble to the Shemona Peraqim, because he has a preamble, and he tells you why it is that he did it, right? I think that that's valuable in and of itself to understand. So I'm going to share the screen and we will read it along with something else that HaRambam wrote. So let me put this up for you. I hope everybody can see it. Yeah. Okay. So you see here it says Hakdama leMasechet Avot, and in brackets Shemona Peraqim. It's otherwise known as the Shemona Peraqim. I also remind you that HaRambam wrote this in Arabic. It's all in Arabic. We, of course, will not be reading it in Arabic. We are going to be reading, as my most favorite translation, Rav Kafir, Rabbi Yosef Kafir. So Rav Kafir translates as follows. And HaRambam writes, כבר ביארנו בהקדמת חיבור זה, מהו הטעם שהביא את המחבר הזה? Who's the מחבר הזה? The מחבר הזה, of course, is Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He's the מחבר of the Mishnah. I already explained to you, says HaRambam, in my own introduction of this whole work, what brought the author of the Mishnah likboa masechto zo beseder hazeh, to establish or to put this masechet, this tractate, namely Avot, in this seder, namely Nezikin. Right now, seder Nezikin literally means the section that deals with damages. Nezikin literally means damages. And who deals with the damages? These are issues for courts and the judicial system. So it deals with judges, it deals with witnesses, it deals with court proceedings, it deals with borrowing and lending, buying and selling, and property law and torts and so on and so forth. It deals with all of those things in Seder Nezikin. Why then is this Masechet that we call Avot, and we have to understand why it's called Avot. HaRambam doesn't deal with that. I'll explain what I believe it to be in a moment. But why this Masechet Avot, which for all intents and purposes deals with, again, like I said, refining character. How it is that a person should live their best and most virtuous life. And much of the Masechet of Avot deals with those things. Why is it placed in Masechet in Seder Nezikin? Right? Why is it in the section of the judges and court cases and things of that nature? So he says, I already explained it to you. So before we go on, I'm going to look at that, right, with you, and we'll see why it is that HaRambam suggests that this was here. So we'll detour for a moment, and we'll have a look. And this is part of the Hakdama. Sorry, it's the wrong one. Should be this one. Hope it works. Also, still not working. Is it working? Hold on. Ah, yeah, it is working. Okay, so now I just lost my other thing. Kasher hishlim. This is the hakdama to the whole Mishnah, Perusha Mishnah. So HaRambam says, Kasher hishlim kol ma shehadayanim tzrichim lo. Once the Mishnah dealt with everything that a dayan needs to know about themselves, about the idim, about the cases that they're going to adjudicate, hitchil avot. he decided to put in avot. Ve'asa ken l'shtei sibot. He did that for two reasons, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Ha'ahat, the first reason, kedei lehodiacha amitut hamasoret ve'kabbalah shehi emet. So that you should know that everything that we're dealing with over here, specifically dayanim, which essentially are poskim, right? They are posek din, right? They establish law. That we recognize that these people don't come out of thin air. And the Torah that they are learning, teaching, and adjudicating does not come out of thin air. That there is masoret. Masoret literally means a handing over. So in modern Hebrew, we say, ani moser lecha. What does it mean, ani moser lecha davar? I'm sending this to you, I'm giving this to you, I'm handing it to you, right? That's what limsor means. So if we're saying ani moser lecha, masoret is a giving, a handing over, a receiving of what's being handed over. So he says, hamasoret ve'kabbalah, both the handing over and the reception of what was handed over is emet. It's true. And how does HaRambam do that? He gives the line. What's HaRambam? The Mishnah does that, right? The Mishnah in Avot opens, Moshe kibel Torah misinai, umsara Yehoshua, Yehoshua al zekenim, zekenim neviim, neviim mesaru al anshe knesset gedola. It gives a very broad stroke overview of how the Torah went from one generation to the next. And it says, Habura mipnei Habura. There you go. Shout out to the Habura in HaRambam's Hakdama to the Mishnah. Amazing. Right? From one group of learning to another group of learning. Yeah? Ulfichach. Sarich lechabed et ha'ish ha'acham ulachshivo be'ma'alat rama. So not only does it show the validity of the Dayanim that are adjudicating the Torah that came from Moshe at Sinai, from one group to the next, to the next, to the next in an unbroken chain, but also you should recognize the honor that should be given to the Hacham that is sitting as either a Dayan or adjudicating or Posek. Why? Because they are the ones that are holding the heritage, right? They're holding what's being given over. And this, what's being handed over from generation to generation. So they are trustees, essentially, of the Masoret. What is a trustee? A trustee holds something in trust. So when you talk about a board of trustees, what's the difference between a board of trustees and a board of directors? There's a very big difference. The board of directors may have executive function in terms of how the day-to-day running of an entity that for which they sit, right, happens. The trustees hold the entire entity in trust. They are responsible for making sure that the whole identity and focus and vision and philosophy and so on of an institution is maintained by its directors, right? And so if need be, the trustees can overthrow the board of directors or clear the board or whatever the case may be, right? So a trustee holds things in trust. And the Hakamim that are studying and giving over the Masoret hold the Masoret in trust. And the trustees of the Torah of Yisrael have reason to be honored, right? Not for themselves, but for what it is that they are actually holding in trust, right? What they have in their treasury. So HaRambam says, a person should recognize these trustees in high regard, because he holds the reception of the Torah in trust. And it doesn't matter which generation we find it, right? Whoever is in a specific generation, the holder of the Masoret, well, then they have to be recognized as the holder of the Masoret. They may be different than the earlier holders. They may not even be on the same level as the earlier holders. And that's why it says, if we're going to start checking after the Bet Din of Rabban Gamliel, we should start checking after the Bet Din of David HaMelech. And so too, they said Shimshon bedoro k'Shmuel bedoro, right? You want to compare Shimshon to Shmuel HaNavi. Shmuel HaNavi himself was compared to Moshe and Aharon. Shimshon was never compared to Moshe and Aharon. He was great shofet in his own right. But nonetheless, the Hakamim say Shimshon in his generation is just as high and just as respected as Shmuel in his own generation. V'yesh b'zeh musar libnei adam. And not only that, in and of itself, there is musar to bnei adam, right? There's something to be learned from this. This teaches us something that what? Shelo yomar adam he'ach nekabel dino shel ploni. That a person should never say to the hacham that's in his generation, how are we supposed to accept the judgments of this person? I remember the previous Dayani was much greater, right? assuming that the Dayan of one's generation is an upstanding fellow, yeah, and faithful to the study, he may not be the same, right? I said that. I said this line in the Shloshim for Hacham Ovadia Yosef to the family. It says Shimshon bedoro k'Shmuel bedoro. Another version of it is Yiftach bedoro k'Shmuel bedoro. Right? So, when you're in the door of Shimshon, you have to hold that Shimshon is like Shmuel. It's very hard to do that when you've seen Shmuel. Right? When you've recognized Shmuel. Right? So I said to them, we saw Shmuel. We saw Hacham Ovadia. We saw him the way that he was and how he worked. There's nobody like him. Still till today, there's nobody like him. I don't know if there ever will be anybody like him. He was Yahid not only in his own door, in many dorot. But does that mean that Psak Din should stop because he lived and he left us and he like everybody before him? No, Psak Din has to continue. And we have to respect the poskim of our generation, as long as they're faithful people and upstanding people. And they're telling me they're Hachamim Amitiyim. ויש בזה מוסר לבני אדם שלא יאמר אדם איך נכבד בנו של פלוני, או האח נקיים תקנתו של פלוני, ואין הדבר כן, שאין דין של פלוני הדיין אלא הוא של השם שציוונו. HaRambam says a fascinating thing over here. He says, after all, the deen that a faithful dayan makes, who has the responsibility of holding the Masorah. Today it's very hard to recognize somebody who holds the responsibility of holding the Masorah itself, because we are so fractured and split apart, and everybody does their own thing. But if we were recognizing somebody that genuinely is part of the Masoret and holding a Bedin over Israel in the way that Moshe Rabbeinu did, no matter how far in history it goes, we can't say that it's just this Dayan who's posek. This Dayan is engaging in the brit of understanding Torah and establishing Pesach Din for Torah, and that is something that we believe HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself blesses and influences, right? We don't say that this person is speaking the word of God, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded us that this is how it should happen. See, it says, Elahu shel Hashem shetzivanu bo. It doesn't say that the word of the Dayan is the word of God. It's that the psak of the Dayan is what HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded should be adhered to. As it says, the mishpat ultimately is le'Elohim. It's one mishpat that was given from one to the next during all the generations. So that's one reason. One reason is recognizing the Masoret and recognizing the trustees of the Masoret that are the Hachamim. The second, and that's why it's in Nezikin, because Nezikin is about the Dayanim. And the Dayanim ultimately adjudicate the laws of Torah. The second is Siba Shenit Kedei Lashmeinu Masechta Azot, to show us in this Masechet Musar Kol Hachamim Hachamim Aleim Hashalom, to let us hear the Musar, the advice, the points of embetterment that the Hachamim of each generation, it goes through the generations Peraqim of the Hachamim, told us that we should do in order to be able to better ourselves and to be more virtuous and upstanding. That we should learn from them the choicest of attributes. Now he says what HaRambam. Why is it in Nezikin? Everybody needs musar. Hadayanim zikukim lahem yoter mikol adam. HaRambam says the dayanim require the refinement of character more than any other human being. They must be refined of character more than any other human being. Dayanim. Why? Why? Because look, the average person, he's not, really studying the refinement of character and working on this on a regular basis. Look, society is not going to fall apart. You're going to still have people that are going to go to work. They're going to go do their tasks. The city will run. The society will run. It might be might not be the most virtuous society in the world, but it'll run. Of course, it's always better when people are doing this. It's not going to fall apart. The only person that's really one's hurting if they don't study and they don't try and develop themselves is oneself. But if Dayan is not somebody who's a Baal Musar, who really is thinking and working his whole life to be able to refine himself this way, and he has proper manners and deals with people appropriately and himself, he ruins the entire nation with his damages. because he's in charge of teaching the Torah, representing the Torah, and so on and so forth. And therefore, the first words of of advice in Masechet Avot is to the Dayanim. It speaks to Dayanim first, and it tells them, Hivu mitunim badin. Pause in your judgment and judge appropriately. And it goes on and on. So I'm not going to go through everything else, but you see those are the two reasons. First reason is Masoret and the trustees of the Masoret. The second reason is that the Musar of Pirkei Avot is put into Nezikin because the Dayanim need it most. Okay, so now we can go back to the preamble of the Shemona Peraqim. Let me just open it again because I closed it by mistake. There we go. Okay. Bear with me. Bear with me. Bear with me. Okay. Very good. Here we go. So HaRambam writes, I explained to you in the beginning why he put this Masechet in this place, which we just read. And ukvar hiftachnu kama pa'amim b'ma shekadam b'chibur zeh shendaber masechta zo b'inyanim mo'ilim shanu na'arich b'me'at. He said, look, I've already said that when it comes to Pirkei Avot, to Masechet Avot, I'm going to speak to you about things that are very effective, very helpful, and I'm going to expand on them a bit, right? Ki afal pishi pshuta v'kala is a beautiful line, this next line. He says, Ki afal pishi pshuta v'kala lehavana lefi apshat, because even though everybody can read Pirkei Avot, right? I'm sure there's many people here who are listening who read Pirkei Avot, either a translation of Pirkei Avot, or even if you understand Hebrew, read it straightforward. It's quite straightforward, Pirkei Avot. It's not so difficult to understand. Some things, as you'll see, HaRambam will say, are difficult to understand, but the basic majority of it is quite easy to understand. However, in asiyat kol hakalul ba kal lechol adam. It's easy to read, not easy to do. V'nosaf lekach, right? And that happens for so many of us. How many of us recognize what is right and what we'd like to do, but find it extremely difficult to do? That's a reality, if we are honest with ourselves, that every single one of us deals with. Depends on what it is for many of us, but all of us experience that as human beings. We want to do something, we know that something is appropriate, but we don't do it, and we find it extremely difficult to do. That happens to all of us in various sectors, right? Oftentimes we want to do things, which is not the same as wanting to do things. Nonetheless, HaRambam says, Nosaf al kach, right? More than that, shehi meviali desh lemut gedola, excuse me, Gam lo kol inyaneha here. V'gam lo kol inyaneha muvanim b'li perush maspik. Some of the things in Masechet Avot also are not so understandable without an appropriate explanation. V'nosav lekach shehi meviya lidei shlemut gedola ve'osher amiti. Not only that, when a person genuinely studies it and implements it, it brings tremendous shlemut. It helps a person become whole. And it gives a person osher. Osher, a lot of people mistranslate. Osher, people think is happiness. And it's not happiness. Simcha is happiness. Sason is a kind of happiness. Osher is not happiness. Osher, it comes from, there's a word in Hebrew for legs, right? A fancy word. And a leg is ashur, right? Ashurav are a person's legs that stand. Osher is stability. So when it says Ashrei Yoshbe Betecha, Ashrei Kol Hosebach, Ashrei so and such and so and so and so and such, what is Ashrei? Many people translate that as happy is the person. That is a mistranslation. It is not about happiness. It might be connected to happiness, but not about happiness. Ashrei Kol Hosebach means sturdy, steady, well-seated, well-standing are those that put their faith in you or put their strength in you. Ashrei Yoshei Betecha. The ones who sit in your house, God, are well-standing. They're sturdy. That's what Ashrei means. So osher is the state of being in security and strength, right? That's what osher is. So people think it's happiness. Okay, so there's happiness with that. Of course, there's happiness with that, but that's what osher is, right? So not only does it give one a wholesome self, a whole self, it gives one genuine stability of self. Genuine stability of character. I want to pause here for a minute and unpack this a little bit, because it sounds lovely that HaRambam is saying it, but he's choosing his words very, very carefully. And he's saying two massive things about what it means to be human. The first is this idea of wholeness. And one of the things that HaRambam is going to open up with in the first chapter of the Shemona Peraqim is that there are various components to our, he calls it our spirits or our nefesh. All of us recognize that there is more than one type of perspective within us. We are not monolithic as human beings. We are complex as human beings. There are many parts to us. And we know this and we use it in our vernacular. So we will say, part of me feels, and another part of me feels. What do you mean part of me feels and part of me feels? Is it you or isn't it you? Well, everybody talks about it this way. Part of me and part. Well, which part? And that clearly recognizes that there are parts. People say, oh, yeah, I'm not myself today. Who the heck are you if you're not yourself? You're yourself. You're just a different version of yourself. That's also in there. Or people say, that's not me. It's not me. What do you mean it's not you? You just said it and did it. How could it not be you? Who was it? Was it an imposter? So we recognize that not only are there different parts to us, there are very often rival parts to us. So that goes back to the point that HaRambam is making. There are things that we recognize as being right that we cannot do and be right with. We find it extremely difficult. We are in conflict. Shelemut is wholeness. Shelemut is finding real and true integration of the parts of us and being able to be all of those elements in a systematic, integrated, faithful way, which takes a lifetime for people to achieve, if at all they achieve. Because in order to achieve the integration of which I speak, it requires a tremendous amount of heavy lifting and work and failure. And that's why one of the reasons I believe that the pasuk says, Sheva yipol tzaddik vakam. A tzaddik will fall 7 times. What do you mean a tzaddik will fall 7 times? It's not just that bad things will happen to the tzaddik. The tzaddik himself or herself will fail. 7 principled times, right? And that, for all intents and purposes, if you say, Yemei shenotenu b'hem shivrim shana, you say, look, the average life is a 70-year span. Well, it looks like it's getting a little longer lately, but nonetheless, the average life is a 70-year. In gvurot shmonim shana, right? If you really push, you've got 80. Well, in an average human life, 70 years, it's once a decade. The tzaddik finds a disaster on his hands of some failure of integration or failure that results of a lack of integration. And that's all the way into the 70s of a person. So what HaRambam is saying is that studying Avot, studying this Masechet genuinely and listening to it and implementing it in a real way brings shlemut gedola. It's not just shlemut, brings great shlemut. And it brings osher amiti. It also brings security or stability, perhaps is more accurate, stability. And what is that about? Well, if we recognize, as the Mishnah Nizikin says, Adam mu'ad le'olam, a human being is always expected to be damaging, right? A human being is always expected to cause damage. And so we have to assume that a human being is a damaging entity. Why is that? Why? Because we're an absolute mess, that's why. Because we are born into this world wild, lunatic beasts. And we take for granted that we just kind of happen to be good people. We don't just kind of happen to be good people. It is a tremendous, tremendous benefit for a child to have parents that at the very least discipline the child. That's why Shlomo HaMelech says, "Hosech shibto soneh beno." A person spares the rod; they hate the child. It's not like the English, editing of that line. The English editing of the line is "spare the rod, spoil the child," which is also true. But that's not what Shlomo HaMelech said. Shlomo HaMelech is talking about how the parent is with regards to the child in terms of the parent, not in terms of the child. Hosech shibto soneh beno. Person who spares the rod hates the child. Why? Doesn't care about the child being able to be a full-fledged human being in the world. Leaves the child to fall all over his or herself in the natural failures of oneself because of what human beings are, the complexities of a human being, the drives of a human being, the arms race that all human beings are in along with every other living thing on this planet. It's a complete disaster. And so it takes a tremendous amount. And that's just out of the gate. Forget about the traumas that people experience in life of parents and people around them and peers and so on and so forth that absolutely blow apart the parts. Because it's hard enough to integrate the parts. When the parts are traumatized, it causes a schizoid effect to the parts, in which the person, in order to be able to survive, has to compartmentalize the heck out of oneself. Now, I may be getting too far on the psychological spectrum for people, but it's important to put it in here because it's really what HaRambam is dealing with. So he says that the wholesomeness, the wholeness, the integration of a person occurs through the study of Avot, and the sturdiness of a person, right? The ability for a human being not to be running at a whim and incapable of reining in one's drives and whims as they come that cause tremendous havoc. Ulfichach, and therefore HaRambam says, Ra'iti le'archiv ba'at dibur. He thought, I really should expound here because it's really important for people to get. Ukvar amru aleim hashalom, and the Hachamim themselves said, may they rest in peace. A person who genuinely wishes to be a Hasid, and we have to explain what a Hasid is, he should fulfill the words of Avot, which is referring to this Masechet. What does it mean that a person wants to be a Hasid? Simply means that a person wishes to be the most viable individual that one could be. Ultimately, it means that a Hasid, cares deeply and focuses one's life on Hesed. Just as a Tzaddik is a person that focuses one's life on Tzedek. What does it mean to focus one's life on Hesed? Hesed is life-giving. Hesed is supporting of life and what is livable and viable. So a Hasid is living in a way, as we'll see, that cultivates the highest level of life for a human being and is not deterred by the terrible drives and whims and all kinds of failures that a human disposition brings with it. And in doing so, and becoming a Hasid and being able to refine oneself, one removes the obstructions that otherwise are there that allow for God to flow through one's life in a full and strong way. So therefore, HaRambam says, "En etzlenu ma'ala lema'ala mina hasidut." We don't have a level that's higher than hasidut, because hasidut is the highest level of living. It is the most conscious and viable level of living, the most wholesome and sturdy level of living. And the only thing that is above hasidut is nibu'ah. But nibu'ah is not in a person's ability to achieve. Because a person can reach the level of nibu'ah, which essentially is hasidut, and not be spoken to by God. But otherwise, really what this is saying is that if hasidut means that a person is nibu'ah ready, It brings one to nebuah. As it says, Hasidut brings someone to Ruach HaKodesh, to having a spirit of sanctity or of unique presence of God in a person. And Ruach HaKodesh is within the family of nebuah. Basically, if A equals B and B equals C, A equals C. And what HaRambam is saying, if you recognize that Hasidut makes one nibu'ah ready, then basically what it's saying is that this Masechet brings somebody to nibu'ah. That's a pretty serious thing to say. I'm going to explain the truth of this. I'm going to explain that because why? Being Navi ready, meaning being a vessel that is capable of receiving the direct communication of God requires a refinement of midot. Because otherwise a person is in complete obstruction, or shouldn't say complete, they're to whatever percentage of obstruction that doesn't allow that flow to occur because they are not in full viable holistic mode. So I decided before explaining each Mishnah, which HaRambam calls halacha, Peraqim Mo'ilim, some introductory chapters. So that a person has some awareness of how the human works before we start talking about what the human should do. And therefore it'll be a key to understanding what it is that the HaChamim are eventually saying in the Masechet. I also want you to know, this is not my own chidush here, what I'm writing for you, nor in the following chapters, nor in my explanations. Ani be from my own heart. It's not, I didn't pull these out of a hat of my own thought. I didn't make them up. They are edited, which means in the sense, not edited in the sense of changed of the language, but edited in terms of gathered and put together by me. I gathered them from various places and put them together. Midivrei Hachamim, I got them from the words of Hachamim in the Midrash and the Talmud. I brought those in. Vizulato mehuburehem, and other of their works. And I also brought in works of philosophers, early and late. And in addition to that, from a whole bunch of works that other human beings wrote. If anybody wondered where the Rambam writes that, it's here. Accept the truth from whomever says it. So I'm telling you that a lot of the stuff that I'm writing here, sure, much of it is from the Hachamim, the Talmud, the Midrashim, the Pesikta, the Sifra, the Sifrei, b'chule, but some of it is from the philosophers, and some of it is just from other people, like doctors and other thinkers that clearly HaRambam read and is editing and distilling for you over here. And it will be times that I will write an entire piece, an entire treatment of an idea that comes from a book that's well known. Usually it's Aristotle. Like what he writes, what HaRambam writes about friends. It's lifted straight out of Aristotle, straight in and put into his Perush, except for the Chavruta in Torah that HaRambam obviously adds over there. And Bechol Zeroah, nothing wrong with that, says HaRambam. I'm not going to take on myself something that somebody before me said. Be clear about it. I'm admitting to you, it's not me. Although I'm not going to tell you who wrote it. Lo azkir amar ploni, so and so said. Why? The fish is why? Because I think it's extra and it's not necessary. Why is it not necessary? He says, why? Because by keeping it anonymous, I may actually cause somebody to listen to it when otherwise they wouldn't, because they don't like the person who said it. Right? Excuse me. Shem, not Sham. Shem oto adam she'oto adavar nifsad. Right? He doesn't like the guy. He doesn't like Aristotle, or he doesn't like Galen, or whoever it is that HaRambam quotes, or Rabbi, or whatever it is. So he doesn't like to listen to it. So HaRambam says, look, take it from me. I'm not going to tell you who it is. Right? He might have a bad idea about it that he doesn't realize. Therefore, I'm making everything anonymous, and I'm just giving it over. My goal is that you should get the ideas, right? Get the points. To really understand the ideas that are hidden within this masechet. And therefore I'm going to begin with the introductory chapters that I've comprised in order, that is all following my goal here. Shemona Peraqim, there are 8 of them. So there you are. I think it's an important understanding, right? To be able to have the preamble of HaRambam and understand what it is that he's thinking and why it is that he's doing it and what it is that Pirkei Avot means to him and so on. So I will leave that with you, and I will leave that here. And Be'ezrat Hashem, I don't remember if it's next week or what it is, or following week. We'll look a little bit into one of the Peraqim. And with that, I bid everyone a good night and an early Shabbat Shalom. Not too early.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you so much, Macham.
Bye-bye.
Great, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.